right now. My microphone just died. I'll have it charged in time for the next session. So, apologies if you're watching the recording. We are on slide 26 of Ecological Economics. We are talking about communal resource management systems. I'm going to try to stay over here so that the microphone can pick me up well enough. Okay, so at the end of our last lecture on Monday, I talked about the tragedy of the commons, and then we said, oh, well, there's lots of examples of communal resource management systems where a community manages a resource, right, and it does not get depleted and destroyed. So tragedy of the commons is sort of, it's one way of thinking, and there are plenty of examples of it not always applying, but for a community, a communal resource management system to be successful, it tends to have these characteristics based on surveys of successful communal resource management systems. Not necessarily all, some, these things all contribute to effective communal resource management systems. I said it enough times. CRMSs, okay? So we've got things like having incentive programs, having conflict resolution mechanisms, all right? You know who the community is, the community that's managing it, and people who are within that community are identified, and then other people who are not part of that community are not necessarily allowed to access the resource. So the group size of the community is known, it's enforced. All these things help to make these systems more stable. Reasonable enough? Question?
Common characteristics, or are they being titled as like universal characteristics?
These are just common characteristics, yeah. So it's not that every successful communal resource management system has these. It's just that in surveys of successful ones, they've identified these as common. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the characteristics have to do with, it's a community that has been established, and it's a community that expects to continue to be established, which makes sense sort of intuitively right there. Okay, great. Now we're going to talk about an example of communal management of resources. In this case, we're talking about community land trusts, which are an interesting system, which are interesting systems. The point is, it's difficult to get enough capital to purchase land and a house. What if you could just purchase a house on land that is managed by a community that you trust? All right? So you've got a group called the Community Land Trust, which owns the actual land. And then that community land trust is usually an elected board, all right, of community members that determines how the land is going to be zoned and managed, and who can purchase land in that area. Question?
Are HOAs an example of this, or are they just accessory?
Homeowners associations are separate from this because they don't actually own the property, but if your property is within a homeowners association, they may have some rules to enforce upon you, like no above ground sprinklers in the community. They don't own the land.
Tiny fascism.
Yeah, it's just cute. It's just cute little fascism, yeah. Yeah. So in the community land trust system, the hope is that this keeps costs of buying a house low. It keeps community structures more balanced, in that the community land trust says, well, we want to have businesses. We don't want to just be a suburb, for example. So we're going to allow businesses to purchase property in this space too, but not really property, more a building. Or they can build a building here. It has to follow all of our guidelines. And then when that property is sold, when the building is sold, they set a certain price tag on the maximum sale price. So you purchase the home, and then you have an investment of equity here in this home on this land that you don't own, But then when you sell the home, you also can't ramp up the price excessively. That way, it keeps homes affordable within the community land trust, which also dictates who's allowed to purchase these homes. It's an interesting system. Where does the money come from for buying all this land? That's a fair question. Lots of different sources. There are charitable foundations that are involved. There are private donors that are involved. There are groups of citizens that are involved. But immediately, it might rub some folks the wrong way. You're like, I own the house. I don't own the land. There's rules. What if the rules change? All right, lots of things to think about here. There are examples of successful community land trusts, however, okay? So right here, we're looking at the little flow chart of how does a community land trust work. I found a bunch of sources on community land trusts, but I kind of liked the Atlanta Community Land Trust source, so I'm using resources here. This is their how does it work page. And here I have an example of a property being sold under the community land, under the Atlanta Community Land Trust, all right, along with a comparison to a comparable property of similar square footage about a block away, all right, and we can see how the prices are slightly, reduced. All right, very good. So, the Community Land Trust gets its funding. It's an elected board. They purchase the block of land, all right, and then people purchase a house on the land. They own the house. You usually have to be income qualified in order to purchase these houses. So it's therefore a resource for low-income individuals, okay? They stay in the house, they build equity. They sell the house, but when they sell the home, the price is set when they purchase the home, or it's limited when they purchase the home, so that they can't realize excessive profit on the house, yes.
Is there different legislation around property taxes for CLPs?
That's a wonderful question. What's the property tax situation like? And I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, I don't know how the property tax is handled. That's really good. Yeah. Good. And look, this data right here is kind of interesting. It's like, 63% of people, you get this for a while, then you sell it, and then you use that money, that equity that you've stored up, to buy a home not part of a community land trust. Which is strange to present the goal is not to have one of our homes, but anyway, here's an actual home currently on the market from the Atlanta Land Trust, all right? This home is reserved for buyers with connections to the West Side neighborhoods. How do you qualify? There's an income level that you have to fall under, okay, and under a certain amount of household income in order to purchase the home. But, it's $195K is their listing price. It's new construction, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. It doesn't look bad. I'd live in that place, all right? Compared to another home, which is 3 bedroom, 2 bath, just about a block away from this place. That's older construction, and that one is classic market, and it's $230,000. All right, so you're not getting a house for $50K, but you're saving that much. Anyways, it's an interesting system, and I hope that you can see how this is sort of maybe a communal resource management system that you might not have initially intuitively thought of, especially when we talk about the tragedy of the commons. It's like, what does this look like when we're not talking about grazing animals in the town square? All right. Well, it can look something like a community land trust. And we're going to talk about other interesting ecological economics moving forward. Okay, great. Malthusian. Malthusian's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot when we're talking about populations and when we're talking about economics and when we're talking about conservation or environmentalism. All right. Thomas Malthus wrote this book in, 1798. All right. Very dark prospect that populations grow and And they only start to get smaller when there's disease or resource scarcity. And then everybody dies, there's a bunch of war that happens, and then the population crashes, and then we recover from that.
And he was spot on.
Yeah. It's a very, and then his solutions proposed are, hey, listen, celibacy, moral restraint, compel a population to reduce birth rates. These are like, so when people say, these are Malthusian ideas, which trust me, you will hear, you will read, you will see Malthusian thrown around all the time. What it's claiming is the population is not going to slow down. There's no recognition from the citizens that we're running out of resources, and then we're going to plummet, and there's going to be a bunch of war and all this. Yes?
Capitalism could be described as Malthusian.
Okay, yeah, capitalism could be described as Malthusian. I mean, yeah, it does sort of require that you have the continued
Malthusian model relies on
constant growth. Yeah, constant growth. Absolutely. Like you were talking about last lecture, right? Where I drew the logistic growth curve and we compared it to the exponential growth curve. And then, yeah, capitalism kind of requires that we just keep growing and it's seen as a necessity. And then we're hoping that in modern economics we recognize that, oh no, we can level out. Absolutely. So listen, there's a couple of books here cited often about changes to this. Like what are the limits, and are there ways for us to get around them? So, limits to growth. All right, Malthusian idea. The population is going to grow, the resources will become depleted, and everything will crash. Beyond the limits, similar authors running the same base model. So limits to growth and beyond the limits are both based on ecological models, right? And we sort of talked about ecological models a lot. Which variables do you choose? How strongly do you weight them? These models can be changed. So including things like replacement or, just something as simple as incorporating a carrying capacity into the model makes a huge difference in the predictions of the population growth. So in this 1992 revision of the model, they put in some information about how as pollution gets more rampant, there's more technology to reduce the pollution. What's the population going to do? All this stuff. It's got a slightly more hopeful outlook. But yeah, so there's different ideas about what's going to happen. And usually when somebody is very pessimistic about what's going to happen, they'll be described as Malthusian. And now you'll know what that means if somebody ever calls you Malthusian. All right? Solid. So, economic models. Right here, this is the same model, okay, but with assumptions changed. So the same starting model of population climbing, resources going down, industrial output rising, pollution rising, and food supplies rising and then crashing. Malthusian outlook, population crashes. More positive outlook, okay? Population stabilizes, pollution rates start to peak, and then pollution abatement is put into place. Population stabilizes, food supply stabilizes, industrial output stabilizes, resources decline, all right? But then the decline hopefully slows. Now, that requires some replacement. Anyways, the whole point here is, which one's gonna happen? What's gonna go on, all right? This is essentially the argument of limits to growth versus beyond the limits. Okay, good deal. Moving forward, so in ecological economics or in economics in general, how do we measure how good the economy's doing? All right. So you've heard the phrase gross domestic product, probably. People are like, oh, the GDP is up, it's good. Or maybe gross national product. All right. It's all about the amount of money being transferred. All right. The money flowing into business. So here's one way of calculating this. Flow of money from households to businesses. They purchase goods and services. All right. Or do we talk about costs of production, which is a more complicated way to look at this, all right? But at the end of the day, it's things are being produced. How much does it cost to produce those things? How much money is being spent on producing those things? Yes, question?
So, a vehicle made and sold by Ford in Europe would contribute to both the GNP and the GDP in the country it's from, and only the GDP if it's sold in the US?
Yes, correct. Yep. So if the vehicle's made by, just for the recording, if the vehicle's made by Ford and sold in America, it contributes to the GDP and the GNP. But if it's sold in Europe, it contributes only to the GNP. Right? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Good. I love it. Okay. So, gross national product, gross domestic product. They're both used, usually pretty interchangeably. All right. But the one you hear about the most is the gross domestic product, because usually people are trying to discuss and make arguments for keeping money flowing within a single country and tracking that. Now, in ecological economics, they put forth that the gross national product and the gross domestic product don't have anything to do, don't account for resource loss. All right? Now, you could make arguments that as you consume the resources, they become more expensive, so now you spend more money to extract them, and that's somehow factored into the models. But the argument of ecological economists is to try to incorporate, as we keep running into, try to incorporate the ecological piece of this, try to incorporate more variables than just how much money is moving in which direction, or to make money move for conservation purposes. All right, cool. So yeah, we've got this example here. There's a big oil spill, and that increases GDP as you spend money to clean up that oil spill. So there are other metrics that attempt to incorporate human well-being, all right, or environmental impacts. So we've got the genuine progress index, as well as something called the, do I have it in my slides? The World Happiness Index, which is also used, okay? But they have all these different indices, which are meant to take into account impact on quality of life, impact on sustainability. Good deal. So the Genuine Progress Index, the Environmental Performance Index, the Human Development Index, the Gender Development Index, the World Happiness Index, they're all based around different metrics, but they're all just a number that gets spit out by a model. All right? So it's a big question of who develops these, who's enforcing them, all right, who's adopted them, is there any information actually garnered by them, do you use them to measure your progress? Really, lots of considerations to be made. All right, so what you're trying to do, all right, is make dependent variables that you can compare to independent variables. You're trying to see how certain changes affect your different index of economic performance, or your different index of overall community performance. So if you're measuring it by how much money you generate, if you're measuring it based on surveys of happiness, if you're measuring it based on reducing inequalities between groups, these are all things that can be measured and can be compared to whatever independent variable you're shifting. All right. Cost-benefit analyses. Usually economic decisions are made based on cost-benefit analyses. But how do we measure a benefit? How do we measure a cost? Okay? So that's the trick here. That's the trick here. The the cost-benefit analysis tries to reach, or the philosophy behind cost-benefit analyses proposes that you're going to hit this balance point right here, and that's where you want to sort of rotate around, where the societal cost and the societal benefit sort of equalize. So you put in pollution abatement measures, and that reduces the pollution, okay? But then there's a cost to that increasement of pollution abatement. So this is just very standard cost-benefit analysis. You want to realize more benefit relative to your cost. That's how most of us interact with the world. That's how economies work, and that's how countries interact and trade and things like this. I want to realize more benefit than what I'm putting in as cost. And everybody trading works that way. The question that comes back again is, how do we measure the cost and how do we measure the benefit? Fair enough? All right. Reagan administration. If you're taking a lot of classes on environmentalism, if you're taking a lot of classes from people 10 years older than me, you're going to hear a lot about Ronald Reagan. All right? And Ronald Reagan made a lot of changes. His presidency resulted in a lot of changes in how things worked within the executive and legislative branches and how things worked in international politics. And one thing that he did was, or that his administration did, was require using cost-benefit analyses in their decisions, in their regulatory decisions. So you have to say, well, the cost of imposing these regulations results in an equal or greater benefit to citizens, all right? And if you're measuring benefit in different ways, this completely changes what this demand or what this ruling requires, right? Because if you're measuring benefit only as GDP, that's very different than if you're measuring benefit as one of the happiness indices, okay? Is that all cool? All understandable enough? Okay, awesome. Yes?
What was the indice you used?
GDP, GNP. Yep. And so the only way to argue for environmental considerations then is to say, if we don't conserve that resource, we're going to incur greater costs, which if we go way back to, some of these slides about like what are the ecosystem services and what's their value, this is how you fit into the cost-benefit analysis based on GDP, GNP. Yes?
So the whole reason we have to do that is because of Reagan.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah. That.
Awesome.
I'm just gonna say yeah. That's at least what the textbooks say. I'm not much of a historian myself. I'm sure there's plenty of people who have more nuance to this, and there have been changes, but that cost-benefit requirement is still imposed, where when you're making these decisions, you have to take into account what's the benefit versus the cost. So
I'm sure the economics are trickling down very well.
it works great, yeah. Yep. Everything trickles. Only the good things roll downhill. So, yeah, I mean, have we hit this bullet point enough? Difficulty arises in assigning monetary prices to intangible or public resources. That's been the whole ecological economics thing. And then in the main textbook that I'm using as I construct this course, they show this image and say, how do you assign a monetary value to this view? And I go, okay, cool, good stuff. Alrighty. Continuing to move forward. Suppliers tend to realize a small portion of the actual profits generated by the sale of their goods. All right, so we've got this coffee. For every $1 of coffee sold, about 8 cents goes to the growers. Because it's traded internationally, 19 cents goes to the producing countries. 28 cents goes to traders, brokers, and shippers. 25% to the people who process the coffee and then do the wholesale market and then sell it to the retailers who then realize 20% of the profit from the sale of that coffee. In your reading of Stuff, The Secret Life of Everyday Things, they do a really, really nice job of talking about these trade systems and how it's not very, well, ends up not being very profitable for the producers, and all of these different entities involved in the transfer of coffee into my mug makes for a lot of inefficiency, waste, and environmental issues. All right? So this is just the, the traditional, the wisdom, the common wisdom of like, the farther it has to travel, the more entities involved, the less money is actually going to the producer of the product that you're purchasing. As a buyer, this could concern you based on the price of the product that you're purchasing. As a producer, this concerns you because the buyer wants to minimize their marginal cost. So they're going to purchase a cheaper product probably. And if you're making a product that increases the price just to realize your 8% that you realize of $1 versus $1.20 requires that you increase the price more drastically, or the price is increased more drastically for you to actually realize any of that additional income because of all of these other entities that are realizing the money, acquiring the money, right? So it becomes an issue. It becomes a serious issue. International trade. If we've established, in a little bit of a sloppy way, but if I've established that all of these additional steps into the transfer of goods and services sort of puts a pressure on the original producer of the good or the service, or reduces the power of the producer of the good or the service, then we can talk about international trade, yes.
So the grower has to sell 13 bags of coffee in order to afford one if they were to buy their own product in the final retail.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're not trading in direct value anymore, right? You're selling 18 bags to buy 1 bag worth of value. And so even if the grower is somebody nearby, if you're purchasing the product that's had to move through all these steps in the market, then you're not trading directly 8 cents worth of coffee for 8 cents worth of dairy. You're instead trading 8 cents worth of coffee, or $1 worth of coffee for 8 cents worth of dairy. And it's another argument for communal markets, and things like that. But then we've got the issue of, why is it still cheaper to buy my coffee from a provider who has had all these additional steps, right? Why is it still cheaper to purchase my coffee from an international grower where money has had to be dispensed to that producing company? Money's gone through brokers and shippers. There's a processor that's separate from the grower, than to purchase it from somebody closer who is doing these steps or cutting these steps out. And it usually has to do with international trade markets, when you see that the prices are so low for a thing that had to travel so far, okay? So this includes the World Trade Organization and the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, all right? So the World Trade Organization is a group of very wealthy countries that are all concerned with ensuring that international trade remains stable. It was originally established following World War II for the World Trade in an older form, the World Trade Organization existed and was established after World War II as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So, while the World Trade Organization was established in 1994, it existed in 1947 as a group of countries that said, hey, we all have an interest in ensuring international trade. The world's gone through a period of instability. Let's try to make sure that trade remains stable. Question?
These countries include...
Oh, gosh. So there's a lot of overlap between the member countries, but you can see a shift since, here we go. You can see a shift based on sort of economic power, all right? Cool. So, I'd like to get a better list of the...
There are maps and the images.
Oh, perfect. All right, yeah, it's not too surprising, right? Especially when you hear the history of the motives for establishing it. Mainly agreements between economic powerhouses that were actively, very closely involved in the war. All right. If you look at WTO members and observers, there's a ton of them. Okay, but the majority of power ends up being held by countries with higher GDPs, GNPs. All right. Not good stuff. The WTO is kind of wild to talk about. There are also these observer countries that exist, and these observer countries that exist do not participate in voting, but have a membership there. Okay. So 98% of global gross domestic product is represented in members of the WTO. And this is in voting members, not the observing members. All right? So what does it do? Okay? It has a bunch of money. It moves a bunch of money around. It signs into agreements. Okay? The members may enter into agreements with one another that dictate how the individual member countries have to operate in order to stay in good standing with the World Trade Organization and their agreements. So there are many examples, not there's lots of, but there are many examples of individual countries, all right, having environmental regulations which were deemed preventative, or they were shown to reduce the freedom of international trade, and therefore the World Trade Organization steps in to say, well, you can't have that rule here. You can't stop the shipments from going through this area, even if it's a protected fishery. You can't stop harvesting in this area. You can't stop the building of this oil derrick because that's a barrier to international trade, and your country's a WTO member. Yes?
So are they just an interest group or like a level of bureaucracy?
It's a massive interest group, right? But it's entered into by governments. So the governments sign on to these agreements, and therefore there's a lot more direct enforcement of the rules instead of just, here are our recommendations, like with the IUCN. You know, we talk about IUCN, and those are just recommendations, and you're not going to get sued by them, because you can't get sued by them because they don't have any legal standing for the recommendations they make. But the WTO can sue you, all right? Now, NAFTA, all right? That's the main agreement of the WTO that's been sort of discussed. It's a massive agreement meant to reduce trade barriers in North America, okay? So, Canada, Mexico, U.S. enter into this agreement in 1994 to reduce trade barriers. This has been replaced in 2020 by the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, all right? But it still has the same goals on paper, is to reduce trade barriers. So the reason that I bring all of this up is because we're talking about externalities and how international trade can lead to serious disparities in income between wealthy and less wealthy countries, all right? And so signing on to these trade agreements, all right, can ensure that you're trading with countries that may be wealthier, but then you're signing up for adhering to their rulings, which is a sticky situation. So there's so much to look into. Check this stuff out if you're interested. There's lots of negative outcomes there. Yeah, unpleasant outcomes. Okay, cool. We're hitting a good timing here. All right. Microloans. What are microloans? Well, microloans are very small loans given out to communities, small scale loans, maybe given out to individuals, but with a charitable mindset. I actually meant to eliminate the microloan slides, but micro-lending, I left it in here, you can tell, because I haven't, formatted everything nice from the 4:3 ratio, okay? So, I just ran into, when I was trying to do my background research on the microloans and the micro-lending, I ran into too many weird, conflicting things about this category. So, the idea behind it is nice. You've got a community that doesn't need much money, needs a very specific thing, like access to mobile phone service, all right? Or a community that just needs to get mobile phones into the hands of its citizens. And they can apply for micro loans, participate in the micro lending market to get very small scale loans with very reasonable terms to people. So it's still a type of trade. There's still money being paid back, but it's on a smaller scale. Okay. Green businesses or green business. When we talk about green business, green building, we're usually talking about building or business with a view towards conservation. Okay? So, one motivation for making your business more green is to adhere to regulations. An easier adoption, an easier way to get people to adopt these techniques is to show them that they can realize a profit later or reduce their costs later. So, having higher fuel efficiency, for example, all right, initial costs, long-term benefits, also the ability to market your company as a green business can lead to increased realized profits in the end, all right? I've got a sort of textbook example of the Gap Incorporated corporate offices, which operate at a very efficient level. They've got a green roof on there, all right? It's to keep them cooler, all right? They are very energy efficient in the building. They have open spaces. They have all of this stuff. They built it with sustainably harvested wood. They used low toxicity paints. They used green design in the building of the Gap corporate offices. All right? Many times when you're building something new, these investments will have a period of time where you get the pay back realized, all right? The question is, retrofitting things tends to not have that same short-term payback. Yes, please.
Is Gap
The clothing company.
the one that uses child labor?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is not a great company, but they have a whole section in an environmental science textbook about how good their buildings were. So now, you get exposed as students to the Gap Incorporated as a leader in green design.
Green design is used for greenwashing largely.
Yep, remember when we talked about the eco centers? Yeah, exactly. So you realize, I'm hoping at this point you realize, like, this is something, okay, but how do we parse that? How do we really balance that with negative impacts of these large companies? So we've got efficiency, product design. Architect William Bill McDonough. I can get there. I can say it correctly. All right. Framework for producing things sustainably. Cradle to Cradle references this. I'm not sure if Stuff references this. I think it does. I get confused sometimes. All right, cool. You make something, you make a lot of waste. Okay? How do we rethink design? All right, well, here's our framework. You break products into 3 different categories of consumables, service products, and unmarketables. All right? So, when you redesign things, all right, this is all cradle to cradle stuff, if you remember. Okay? When you redesign things, you want to think about consumables a waste product that can be consumed. In the textbook, in this table, we're talking about using these things as food for other processes. What it means is it can be broken down, it can be consumed, it can be composted, it can be burned, it can be used as a biofuel. All right, how do you take this thing which was waste and turn it into a consumable? All right, so you've got these consumable products that get generated. Service products, all right? This is a wild one. Don't own these durable service products like a television. Instead, lease it, and then when you're done, it goes back to the producer who's dedicated to disassembling the product and then repurposing the parts, extracting any consumables that could be pulled out of it, all right? And then unmarketable products. So you think about your waste byproducts that can't be used for anything else, and you term those unmarketables. This is a proposed new way of thinking about design, thinking about production. Okay?
Renting forever.
Huh?
Renting everything forever.
Yeah, you'll own nothing and you'll like it, right? That's what they say. I know. Yeah. So here's this nice 3 simple principles for redesigning processes and products. The big one, I just wanted to include this because you read Cradle to Cradle. That concept of using the waste products to feed back into other processes. It's something to be considered. Rethinking product design, rethinking supply chains, rethinking this stuff. All right. All important. Great. I'm pretty excited to get into conservation easements. This is the slide I wanted to get into today, but we are out of time. So we will come back to green consumerism on Monday, and then we will cut into conservation easements very quickly, and that's going to be some pretty fun stuff, I think. Anyways, happy Halloween to all of you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. This is week 10, people. We're through week 10, so...
2/3.
I know, it's shocking. 2/3 of the way, and vacations in November. It's going to happen. Farewell, everyone.